Hello there, and welcome to this special episode of Sandbox, the podcast brought to you by Bureau Happold. Each month, we ask those big questions about our world and the built environment we place upon it. This month's episode is called Heart of the Capital, Rethinking Capital Living. Now, dear listener, here is your starter for 10. In the World City Index, only 2 cities get the Alpha++ city ranking, but which 2 are they? No Googling now. Just shut your eyes and think of all the cities you've lived in, worked in, or visited. What makes them great? What makes them not so great? Well, those top 2 cities are New York and, drumroll please, London. You might be sitting there thinking, quite right too. Or you might be thinking, what? How do they work that out? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are many metrics used to measure a city's success. One ranking even has a coolness index, the prize for which Berlin has grabbed with both its groovy hipster hands. Meanwhile, according to the Global City Power Index 2024, London is number 1 thanks in part to coming top in the cultural interaction and accessibility functions. When it comes to livability, the city has clawed its way up to 6th position overall. In 1777, Samuel Johnson is reported to have said that if you're tired of London, you're tired of life. But if Johnson could visit London today, what would he see? What is the experience at street level of London's residents, workers and visitors today? Are they tired of London? Or is London tired? And if so, how do we breathe life anew into the city? And indeed, what is London already doing right? What capital ideas can we be inspired by from other top European cities? London, like many capital cities, stands at a crossroads. It faces challenges such as housing shortages, the impact of hybrid working, and climate resilience. Here to explore these challenges and look for solutions, we have assembled a mighty panel of big thinkers. A dynamic duo of Bureau Happold luminaries. We have Laurie Robertson. Laurie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I'm head of strategic planning here at Bureau Happold, and it sounds like a grand title, but in essence, my work is with cities all around the world, with cities, with governments, with developers, working on how we fix and enhance our existing cities and how we build new ones. I'm based here in London, and it's in London that I cut my teeth on some of our complex regeneration projects that make the city what it is now today, for good and bad.
We're delighted to have you on the show, Laurie. And we also have Rainier Valcassel. Rainier, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Rainier from Bureau Happold. I'm in the infrastructure team here in London, discipline director. My specialties are really around cityscape, designing and building new cities from the ground up, but also at a campus scale, looking to integrate new technologies and innovations around infrastructure to make cities future-proof and future-forward. Key things for us really is looking at resilience with regards to climate, but also to make spaces more usable and consider people's well-being.
Well, it's brilliant to have you both on the show today. Thank you both so much for joining us. Let's get stuck in, shall we? And I'm going to launch straight at the deep end with what are the challenges facing London and how has its role as a global city evolved in recent years? And Laurie, I'll go to you first.
I think so. It's a really good challenge that you pose there for us. And I'd say that for London, we do still cling on to that Alpha++ status that you introduced at the start, but we're facing challenges to that. And those challenges are both external and they're internal. The external ones, I think we all know. We're a global city, but in a deglobalizing era in the world. There are challenges coming from the outside in terms of the fragmentation of that international market, which London has built its success around serving. And there are a lot of cities which are starting to invest heavily in the things that will really allow them to challenge and compete with London on a level. On the other side, if you like, the challenges that we've made for ourselves is that whilst we've been economically, and I'd also argue culturally, very creative, it's allowing us to keep renewing that position that we haven't done so well with some of the things that make the city livable for our existing residents, attracting the new talent that we need as a city, and attracting the firms and investment that we needed to back that up, so that the quality of life that we offer as a city, the quality of a place to work, to build, to operate a business, is becoming more and more expensive for what you get over the years.
Thank you, Laurie. And I'll ask Rainier the same question to you, please.
Yeah, I think some good points there from Laurie. I think of it from a people point of view and from a user point of view. The scale of London is sort of really conducive to help people move through spaces and connect. I think definitely off the back of COVID, residents of London have really started to realize that it's actually quite a decentralized city, or at least it's becoming so. Less of a reliance on getting to the city center, but more looking at having some hubs for people to sort of congregate around and really create communities and some real separate sort of cultures around the different spaces around London. From a district or from a campus point of view, you see a lot of new developments popping up, like Battersea down in South London, where there's a brand new development coming along, which has really been a big catalyst for regeneration. And you can sort of see communities really propping up and businesses making that their home. Likewise, in Stratford, off the back of the 2012 London Olympics, that whole massive regeneration piece around the key facilities in Stratford, but also the Queen Elizabeth Park and all the new residential buildings that have sort of risen up off the back of that. You can see how people have realized they don't have to be in the center of London. There's a really good opportunity to leverage different thought pieces like the 15-minute city or connected cities and providing that connectivity. I think where London could possibly do better in the future is finding a way to connect all of these mini hubs to create this connected city. I think we are getting there. There's a lot of public sector funding and even private sector funding and looking to leverage that. But it's how we zoom out and from a cityscape point of view, identify what those key connection points are.
And I'm so glad you brought up the concept of the 15-minute community. This is something I've talked to you both about before, actually. And Laurie, I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the 15-minute community, please.
Yes, it's a concept that actually has been with us for a long time in planning terms, but it's come to have a much larger debate and resonance around it recently. At base, it's a very simple and very powerful concept, which is simply that many of the things I need to make my daily life livable, easy, workable should be within easy reach of me. The 15 minutes is arbitrary, if you like, but the principle that I can access the education for my children, the basic shops and services that I need, sometimes where I work, the places that I go for recreation and leisure, all within easy, sustainable transportation distance, I think is really important. What's sometimes lost, though, in the discussion of the 15-minute community in the London context is that cities work at least at two scales, and all of our daily lives work at two scales. A global city like London works off the back of having complex economic clusters. Those clusters call on talent from across the city, so that anyone's experience of living and working in London needs to be able to work at both of those levels. There's that community that I have nearby, easy to use, easy to access, but there's also that bigger city economy that I need to easily be part of and to easily access. So the best 15-minute communities are ones which are networked, not simply isolated urban villages.
And that actually follows on really nicely with a point that, Rainier, you talked to me a bit about before, is about how we use the space, because you were talking about how London itself has this radius of 25, 30 kilometres, whereas a 15-minute community is closer to 1 kilometre. So yes, if you could talk around that a little bit, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think just following on from what Laurie was mentioning, I think it comes down to the user. So if I use myself as an example, my daily commute, luckily enough to have two options. It's either a short walk to the station, jump onto the tube, and another relatively short walk to get to the office in about 20 minutes. But I could also cycle. So I think it's having those different scales, but also thinking about the actual end user. A city like London has a lot of opportunities to leverage the existing streetscape and the existing networks that it has to really enhance that experience. So that city fabric that we see is really prime for development. And again, when I say development, looking forward to the future, I guess our big hope is that would look to leverage sustainable forms of transport, really starting to think about what our streetscape looks like, think about from a placemaking point of view and from a people point of view. So that could be less cars and more cyclists or more pedestrians. And it's really looking at making those spaces conducive to that sort of mode of transport.
Brilliant stuff. And the whole sort of sustainable travel thing is something I want to have a look at a bit later in the episode. So let's have a look at the modern urban trends now. Now, obviously, I think we keep thinking it since lockdown. Maybe you'll say it's been going on before that. But the whole sort of working trend in London has changed, hasn't it? And now we've got hybrid working. And how has hybrid working reshaped the urban landscape? And I'll go to Rainier first for that one, please.
Yeah, I think off the back of COVID, you can definitely see workers' behaviors changing quite a bit. So less of an onus of having to travel into work at a specific time. So I think what's quite nice to see is a bit of a lower peak with regards to morning and evening traffic, which again gives people that flexibility to come into work when they need to, but also work from home. Pretty much means that homes are now becoming more functional spaces. So there's that dynamic of living spaces now becoming working spaces as well. And you can see the office space also having to transform and modify and sort of change to meet the actual office user needs. We've just moved into a new office in Old Street, and you can kind of see that dynamic really coming through, where there's a lot more breakout spaces, places for people to rest and interact with other people. So it's definitely changing that office space market. I think you can also see less large offices in the centre of London, a lot more satellite offices. And again, that really feeds into that connected or 15-minute community model.
Fantastic stuff. And moving on with the modern urban trends, Laurie, you've talked a lot about how it's essential that London maintains its attractiveness as a city to keep its high rank as an Alpha++. The high cost of living in London, I suppose, needs to be addressed to maintain this attractiveness. And with rising city rents and real estate prices, are we pushing key workers further and further out of the cities, and commutes to city centres becoming too time consuming in a working day? And as well as the 15-minute community, is there a solution?
Yes, I think this is a really good point that you're making here, Andy. And I'd start it with a small anecdote. I used to live in North London, and at the end of my street, we had the perfect community state nursery, which was an easy 1.5-minute walk for my toddlers. However, all of the staff had to commute in from beyond Zone 6. That's not really the ideal of the integrated 15-minute community that we're all thinking of. And I think here it's important to look at both where we've succeeded in setting out the models for these, but also some of the areas where our models are a little bit more challenged. Renia was introducing earlier on some of the kind of real successes that we've had as a city in creating, in our regenerations from the 80s and 90s onwards, new intensive city centre areas. We regenerated ex-industrial areas. We created integrated high-density live-work communities. They've been models for regeneration projects worldwide. And projects like our recent Battersea one, I'd include in there the Olympic Park. They've all been very influential. But we do have to be honest with ourselves that they also contain the seeds of the challenge. For every one of those projects that we created, each of them heavily invested in, carefully worked, and that's an investment both of money on the part of the private sector and on the part of government, and an investment of time. Again, a huge amount of consultant and designer and developer time went into thinking them through, and a huge amount of time went in from the city side into regulating, planning, and approving them. And they've been great successes. The places that we created often had very divided housing markets. There was a small amount of affordable housing, barely meeting or not managing to meet the demands of a large community that needed it on one side, and to offset that, a small amount of very expensive market housing that could only be accessed by the top decile in London. For many of the people working in the middle of our new economy, the backbone of the creative economies, professional services, tech and life sciences sectors that are underpinning London, that housing wasn't accessible. They've been forced to live ever further out, and so the other part of London's growth in this period, the much larger part, has taken place in ex-urban Aylesbury or many of the other areas far out beyond the boundary of London, in areas that frankly you could say are space left over after NIMBY planning battles, in small box communities that are car dependent and lack the key services that they need. So although we've pioneered models of the 15-minute community, which in some ways have been very influential, our underlying problem is that we haven't necessarily found a way of making them affordable. And with that, we haven't found a way of making a transformation at the scale of the whole city, the transformation at speed and scale that we talk about when we're really thinking about how cities adapt, both adapt to economic trends and adapt to climate trends.
Thanks very much, Laurie. And following on from that, I'm going to put you both on the spot here. What are the solutions? Rainier, I'll go to you first, please.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think a really difficult question to answer. I think what you find sometimes is these really successful projects and successful models like the 15-minute community become a victim of their own success. So you can see all the new development popping up all around London, and with that, some private sector investment through, for example, bids or business improvement districts coming up like Battersea. You've got Coldrop Yard in King's Cross, really high-end development, and that really attracts quite an aggressive housing market, and you can kind of see the housing prices in those areas really skyrocketing. So I think it's a case of how do we really encourage and instigate positive growth within the city that both connects people, aligns with the sustainability and carbon neutral aspirations of London, but at the same time is very much people focused. So I think those are the key challenges. There are probably a few ways to look at it. There's the top-down approach, which is very much led by government policy, local government policy as well. In London, you've got all the different London boroughs who have funding and really invest in infrastructure and public spaces. But then there's also the bottom-up approach. So is there any way to really get communities involved in the process? That could be by funding small initiatives or really giving people that space and that drive and some funding to really start to build up their communities by themselves. I think that could be a really good catalyst. I think at the end of the day, you can apply the most forward-thinking policies and strategies, but we really need to get people to buy into it and really own it. I think that's the best way to really drive change.
Yeah. And I suppose a key thing with a lot of these projects, and I know this is something that we talked about previously, is how with these regeneration projects, we balance those modern developments with preserving the cultures. I mean, it's so important that those cultures that are built up in places. Laurie, anything to add?
Absolutely. I mean, if maybe I was being a little dour about the challenges coming out of some of the projects that were done within the past 2 decades, if I look ahead, I think there's some reasons for optimism. And to pick up on some points that Renier was making earlier on, the first is that recently we've changed the exam question. If we weren't doing too well on the old one, a couple of things have become really important. London in this period has managed to change its economy. We're no longer just the intensive financial services and professional services economy that drove the intense concentration that you saw maybe in some of previous decades. In this period, we've grown tech, we've grown life sciences, and many other sectors as well. And both that's diversified the economy, but geographically it's also diversified. The footprint of that economy is not just London, it's also the wider southeast. It's the Oxcam corridor, it's much wider areas. So that new economy takes place over a wider area. That gives us one set of opportunities. The next is, just as Renier was mentioning, the pandemic did change our patterns of work. I always like to say that we made 20 years progress in 2 years. It's just we're not sure which bits of that was progress yet. However,
like
in being able to, we've got a lot to mine out there. That change in working patterns and that change in the pattern of the economy spreads the area over which people could live. It spreads the area over which you can still be fully networked into that global city economy that we have. And with that, I think we've got a lot of opportunities. So that would be the first bit from my perspective. The next bit, and again, picking up on some of the things that Renier says, we need to look kind of critically at the model of community and place that we developed. That 15-minute community in terms of proximity, in terms of mix, in terms of access to open spaces, alternative transport choices was great. But we did do it in a way that I would argue as a designer was very heavyweight. We made for very heavyweight public realm. We made for extensive, expensive infrastructures to underpin it. Really high quality, but ultimately a model that we can't afford to roll out to everyone, and we can't afford to roll out to everyone fast. So I think the challenge for us as we go forward is how do you get the benefits of that model of place that we created? How do you take it to the places that are now networked into the new economy that can work because we've changed our working patterns, but do it in a way which is lighter touch? It's lighter touch in terms of the financial resources it requires, but also that helps it to be more sustainable. It means that some of those parts, being able to walk places, being able to cycle places, the things that are cheap to do, become a more important part of it, easier on some of the heavyweight investments within it. Same in terms of how we think about the model of the housing that we create. How do we create housing that meets people's needs better than it is, but doesn't have the same expensive footprint that we've had up to now?
Excellent. You touched there upon transport and networking, access, getting around, and you also use the word footprint, which is all segueing seamlessly into my next point, which is about the progress that is being made towards sustainable cities and reducing our dependency on cars. Now, Rainier, you used the lovely phrase when we were chatting about this previously. You were talking about how London has a lot of good intentions around active travel, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, you could definitely see the London Borough is really investing a lot, especially in cycling infrastructure, walking infrastructure. A few years back, there was the Mini Holland initiative, which I think put forward just over £30 million of investment towards active travel. And you can really see how a lot of boroughs have taken that forward and used it as a catalyst to create these spaces and also create opportunities for people to have alternative options when it comes to transport. So I think that's really great to see. I think where we could do better is how we connect those spaces up. So thinking about where I live in Haringey, a lot of good intentions with regards to connectivity, cycleways, and new public realm, especially on the approach to major transport links. But again, I think there's some lessons learned where adjoining boroughs or different boroughs can really look at best practice of how to use those spaces in a really clever way, not just a focus on quality finishes and surfaces like Laurie said, but also looking at how they could do it in an economical way as well. So I think there's some good intentions. It might just be a case of how boroughs join up and really join up their resources to connect these spaces, again, with a focus on users.
I love that. And just think about listening to you talk then, I'm thinking about how I think London's very good at celebrating itself, but I think sometimes London needs to celebrate the more esoteric elements of itself. For example, Bureau Happold actually has been involved in the Great British Engineering Adventure, which is this fantastic collaboration with Footways, who make maps for walks. And they talk about how we shouldn't necessarily always be taking the path of least resistance from point A to point B in London. There's all these incredible little back streets and everything, all these lovely adventures you can have in London, all these little mysteries to unpack and discover. There's a lovely walk, going around and seeing all the engineering marvels of London via the various mainline stations. And I just think if the boroughs could tap into that, maybe celebrate some of what makes them unique, that sounds like a lovely plan to me. Laurie, what would you add to that?
I think it's particularly for the existing areas of London, it's taking that new exam question that I was mentioning earlier and using it as a way of being able to look at what they have, at the old problems afresh. Because if in an area that used to work as a commuter suburb, for example, people are now working differently, they're studying differently, their daily patterns are different, the way in which they use retail, another sector which has changed enormously, is changing, then the same old city that you had is a different city. At least it has different opportunities and potentials. And I think within that, we've got a lot, if we take a very honest look at how we live now, at the sustainable systems that we need to underpin that, whether on the digital connectivity front, on the active transport front, on the energy infrastructure front, and the new pattern of economy that we have, we can probably get something quite different out of the areas that we've had, so that old problems that looked intractable become more tractable in that context. It needs an honest look, and it needs sometimes a change in the base, the assumptions that underpin our planning system, the assumptions that underpin our regulations, in order to be able to take that look afresh. It's a collective conversation. It's a conversation between the developers, residents, designers, and city to be able to understand how you can rethink the same old areas that we have at the moment.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. It's just struck me that walking in London in autumn and winter, England's not famous for its weather, now is it? So when you think about European cities that are doing active travel really well, I'm just wondering if any examples pop into the minds of you both as you're sitting there thinking. I'll throw that open to both of you. So whoever wants to answer first, basically.
Because I'm very biased towards London. So Laurie, maybe you wanted to start answering that.
You do love London, don't you?
I love it.
I'll just start by saying that in some ways, some of the leaders in this space across Europe have weather which is at least as bad as ours, if not worse.
I think we just like to we just like to flagellate ourselves, don't we?
Indeed.
We love to think that we have rubbish weather.
I was talking this morning with the urban planning lead in our Rotterdam office, and the weather we were sharing was pretty much the same. If I talk to our team in Copenhagen, it's the same but a bit colder. And in Berlin, sometimes it's the same but even colder. So in that sense, back to the old adage, there's no such thing as bad weather, there's merely bad clothes.
Nice.
The same applies at a city level as well, in a way. If you adapt your infrastructure in the right way, if you adapt your city form in the right way, you can work with a wide range of climates. And that's going to be an important one for London. There's no question that, sadly, what climate change will throw at us in the coming decade will mean greater extremes in what we have. Sometimes there'll be more inclement weather, sometimes it will be hotter, sometimes the temperatures will vary more. We'll need a city which is more resilient and can deal with a wider range of climate extremes and work better at the same time.
So thank you. So when you see active travel in other cities, and admittedly, I retract what I said before, cities that might have the same sort of weather as London, what cities are already doing things brilliantly, be it cycling, walking? What's going well, Laurie, and where?
I think some of the usual suspects definitely come to mind. There's no question that the major Dutch cities and Copenhagen as well are dealing with or addressing the development of integrated cycling networks, and cities which are scaled to take advantage of that, and clusters of uses which are scaled to take advantage of that. They're doing really well. As ever, with a transportation network, it's two things at once. It's the transportation system that you have, but it's always just as much the distribution of activity, the pattern of activity and uses, which matters just as much. What's known in the business as transit-oriented development. How do I reshape my city around those transportation systems? If we look across a swathe of leading Northern European cities, they do that very well. And I think there's a lot that we can learn in it. And it's really important to say that, again, we often look across the fence and say, well, grass is greener on the other side. Those cities, they're better resourced, aren't they? They have things that we don't have in London. I think it's to quote the mayor of Copenhagen, when asked about how did he afford his cycling initiatives, he said, how could I not afford them? Given the budget challenges we were facing, this was by far the most cost-effective approach to improving transportation and access provision for our people that we could think of. And I think that does apply to a lot of the things that we're talking about here in the context of that need to lower the cost of quality of life that we're providing for a city like London. Some of these chosen the right active travel measures, the right sustainable travel measures are ways of creating a city which is both, it reduces the cost of the infrastructure investment now, it also reduces the operational and running cost of the city in future, the cost that we load onto our residents and businesses all the time. So really important to think of it in those ways.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And you know what? You made me think that whenever I meet somebody visiting from overseas in England, I always feel the need to apologise to them for the weather. And I'm going to stop that from now on. So obviously Copenhagen is a place that we can learn fantastic lessons from about, active travel, its dominance of cycling culture. But I imagine there's probably lots of lovely lessons we can learn from other cities around Europe. Berlin, for example, where I understand Bureau Happold has just celebrated 30 years of having an office there. And the projects that have been going on in Berlin, there's been a lot of work around sponge city initiatives, which my understanding is about trying to mitigate the impacts of floods, be it nature-based solutions involving living roofs and that sort of thing. I wonder if you can tell me, Rainier, I'll go to you first, if you can think of any exciting initiatives around nature-based solutions that have been helping in that sphere.
Yeah, definitely. I think from a London point of view, a lot of sponge city typologies that you can see around the city, we tend to call them SUDs, or sustainable urban drainage systems, which are quite useful. Again, the whole premise there is to hold back water as long as you can and try to replicate the actual natural water flows and paths for runoff, given that cities are essentially massive hardscapes, and that built environment has that knock-on effect of really getting the water to source a lot quicker. So one good example is in Elephant Park, one of our projects. We developed a brand new park, which was very much focused on incorporating bioswales and rain gardens within that new park typology, which essentially was a mechanism for us to hold all the water in the park before connecting back to the existing drainage networks. Essentially what that does is it just provides a lot more resilience. It prevents any flooding of the existing systems, but it also helps to improve the water quality that then goes back into our local watercourses and back into the Thames. So again, London's doing a lot as part of the London plan to really leverage that. I think you can see it in a lot of other cities as well, are really picking that up.
This is a really important point that Renia is raising here, that these types of what we would call blue and green infrastructure initiatives, they have multiple benefits because, of course, we're addressing those rising flood risks that are facing our cities in the context of climate change. But at the same time, rather than just providing a grey infrastructure piped solution to one challenge, they provide multifunctional spaces. They're providing the open space that we need. They're providing the routes for active travel that we need. So that one infrastructure investment is working harder. And often that one infrastructure investment into that new green space or park can be much more cost effective than the grey systems that we would otherwise have had to have built. So they make a real difference. And it's something that we're certainly applying as BH in our practice all across the world, and definitely bringing back into the London context as well. That basic insight, in a way, that came initially from the Dutch, that rather than fighting the water, you make room for the river, you make room for the water in your city. You don't have a flooding problem, you have a land use problem.
Yes.
And you work up from that to create a city that works in balance with the natural systems that it's accommodating and gets the maximum out of those natural systems in terms of the wider ecological benefits and the wider public realm and community benefits, as well as just managing a water problem.
And what I would say is half the time they're invisible. You don't even know that they're there. So you don't see a horrible gully or a curb upstand. It's integrated into the natural environment. So again, it's that connectivity with nature. And again, that just feeds into well-being. People can really integrate and interact with those spaces. So when you don't have a large rainfall event, essentially it could just be a park or an open area, grassed area or a flower bed. And then when it does need to be functional and do some heavy lifting, it's there to do so.
Yeah, rises to the occasion. Laurie, you mentioned the Dutch again, because I think Copenhagen and Rotterdam, they're both big pioneers, aren't they, of nature-based solutions to mitigate flood risks. Now, we are going to don our futuristic silver spacesuits. Well, actually, they're not spacesuits because we're not travelling in space. We're travelling through time, and we're going to travel to 2050. Now, what is your dream capital city, panel? And so the dream capital city that you'd like to see, and how best can we achieve that? Rania, I'm going to go to you first. What's your dream? Actually, the London you'd like to see in 2050.
I think the London I would like to see is car-free. I think that's a really big goal. We've got a long way to go, but just having those open spaces, giving back space to people, to pedestrians, to cyclists, but then also finding a way to bring back nature back into the city. There's so many existing watercourses that have been buried by roads and development. If there's a way to re-engage and reinvigorate those spaces to really create a city that's more conducive to nature and really considers the climate going forward. So I think if we can get rid of the cars, that would be great. I think how people interact with the city. So again, I think it comes down to user behavior. It's very easy to change regulation and take away cars or provide new infrastructure for cycling and pedestrians, but there has to be a driver from the residents of London to really make a change. I mean, that could even be as something as small as thinking about circular economy, how you recycle, how you reuse things. So I think it's definitely twofold. The city needs to modernize and adapt. It has all the tools it needs to do so with regards to giving space over to people, pedestrians and cyclists. But then we have to think about the human scale as well, how people use the space and how people change their behavior going forward.
Thank you. And Laurie, the same question to you. What's your dream city of 2050?
To keep it with London as well, I think if I look ahead to that 2050 for London, which in city planning terms is actually not so far away, two things. I'd love to see London retain its role as a global centre for innovative economies, for knowledge generation, for the kind of the openness and cultural creativity that it has at the moment. So I'd love to see us keep there with all the change that will imply. Equally importantly, the big change I'd like to see is that London fundamentally changes that cost of quality of life equation for its residents. It's become heartbreakingly expensive, and with that, heartbreakingly underperforming for far too many of its residents at the moment. And what I'd love to see is a London that is managing to provide housing for its residents affordably, good housing affordably, that's managing to create that connectivity and access, be it digital and physical, across the whole economy for its residents at prices that they can afford. And it's creating those local, resilient 15-minute communities that we were talking about, accessible to everyone, so that those, what's a lottery at the moment, I live inside it, I can access it, or I don't for many, becomes something which is a model which is universal. With that, I'd expect, and to be slightly controversial for a moment, that this is a London that will need to spread far beyond its current boundaries by 2050. We'll only achieve that if we integrate our planning and management of the whole wider functional city region around London, and that's a big space. We talk about the 100-mile city. Doesn't mean unified political governance, but it does mean coordination and cooperation to be able to make all of that work together as an integrated whole.
That's a fascinating idea about the 100-mile city. Now, obviously, active travel is great, but with a 100-mile city might be slightly more problematic. So what do we do about public transport in 2050? What's the future there? I'll go to Laurie first.
I think it's a really important point that you raise here. Rightly, we've been talking a lot about how I move within that 15-minute community. But once you move up to that other scale of connectivity that we were talking about, the thing that keeps us working together as a connected global city, you're moving over much longer distances. Every city needs backbone transportation infrastructures. And in London, again, it's a mixed story. We've done some really good ones. We've done world-class projects. I mean, most recently, things like the Elizabeth line. The problem is we make them rather expensive and we do them rather slow. The Elizabeth line is great, but it's 30 years after we said we needed it. We already need the next one, and the delivery of that is a long way over the horizon. We need to find ways of taking that backbone infrastructure that we have, the railway system particularly, but also our the road network that underpins the capital and the wider region around it, and reuse that intelligently, frugally, augment it so that it can create backbone connectivity that we need to underpin the city in the future.
Thank you very much. And Rainier, have you got anything to add to that?
Just second that point. If you look at London's backbone transport infrastructure, you look at the London Underground, over 160 years old and still going strong, right? So we've got a lot of really good infrastructure that just needs to be upgraded, and it's doing a really, really good job. I think cost of transport is an issue, so I think that's something that we do need to consider. And then maybe in the future, it's leveraging future technologies around autonomous vehicles and around electric vehicles for that last mile or maybe last 5-mile journey. So it's really looking to the future, but at the end of the day, the backbone infrastructure is there. London is really well connected.
Thank you so much. And again, it keeps coming back to that sort of integration and connectivity and joined up thinking, I suppose. So there we have it. Residents, workers and tourists still have much to love and be excited about in London and other European cities. But there are challenges, not least maintaining cultures and communities and enabling those who work in London to live there. And of course, investing in sustainable and resilient infrastructure is more key than ever. But in a city bubbling with lively ideas and capitals around Europe to provide inspiration, Samuel Johnson can look on and write a very encouraging diary entry about 21st century London. A huge thanks to our fantastic panel, Buro Happold's very own Laurie Robinson and Rainier Valcarel. Thank you all very much indeed. And we'd love you to get involved, dear listener. Join the conversation by using the hashtag #BHSandbox on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe to follow the show. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual sources of podcast goodness. Tell us about what you love about London. What could it be doing better? And what is the London you would love to see? Thanks for listening.